February 18, 2025. 9:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. 62nd floor, Glass Tower 1, Midtown Manhattan, New York City. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline shimmered under a pale winter sun, the Hudson River reflecting streaks of cold silver light, while yellow taxis crawled like insects through the streets far below. Inside the executive boardroom of Arclight Dynamics, a fast-rising technology logistics company valued at nearly $420 million, the air was thick with anticipation, ambition, and the electric tension that precedes history being made. 23 board members sat around a long obsidian conference table polished so perfectly that it reflected their anxious faces back at them. At the center of the table lay the final acquisition contract that would seal a multi-billion-dollar partnership between Arclight Dynamics and TitanSphere Holdings, a global conglomerate worth over $18 billion. The pens were already aligned neatly beside the signature pages. The media teams were waiting downstairs. Investors were watching remotely. Everything was in place. Daniel Whitmore, the 43-year-old founder and CEO of Arclight Dynamics, stood at the head of the table dressed in a tailored navy suit, his posture confident, his expression composed, his presence commanding. He had built this company from a small rented warehouse in Brooklyn into a national logistics innovator in less than 9 years, and today was supposed to be the culmination of every sleepless night, every risk, and every sacrifice. His voice, steady and articulate, had just begun outlining the shared vision of innovation and global expansion that this partnership would create when something unexpected interrupted the rhythm of the room. The massive presentation screen behind him flickered, glitched for half a second, and then switched from the acquisition slides to a different display entirely. At first, no one reacted because they assumed it was a technical malfunction, but when the screen stabilized, the silence that followed felt like oxygen being sucked out of the room. Projected in brutal clarity was an email thread with the subject line, "Last night meant everything." The sender's name read Daniel Whitmore. The recipient's name read Elena Voss. Elena Voss was not just any name. She was the wife of Richard Voss, chairman of TitanSphere Holdings, the very man seated across from Daniel at that very moment. The content of the email was intimate, emotionally charged, unmistakably romantic, and impossible to misinterpret. A timestamp revealed it had been sent at 1:12 a.m., just hours earlier. Before anyone could process what they were seeing, another image appeared, a high-resolution security still taken at 11:18 p.m. the previous night, showing Daniel entering a private penthouse suite at the Meridian Hotel. Elena stood beside him, her hand lightly touching his arm. The room did not erupt into chaos. It did something far worse. It froze. Investors stared at the screen in disbelief. Board members shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Legal counsel began whispering urgently among themselves. Daniel's face drained of color as he turned slowly toward the screen, his confident composure collapsing into visible shock. He had not authorized this display. He had not anticipated this exposure. The carefully constructed narrative of visionary leadership disintegrated before his eyes in less than 10 seconds. Richard Voss rose from his chair with deliberate calm, adjusting his cufflinks as if he were preparing to deliver routine remarks rather than confront the man who had betrayed him both personally and professionally. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried no shouting, no theatrics, only a controlled, surgical precision that cut far deeper than rage ever could. He asked whether this was the integrity that Arclight Dynamics intended to bring into a billion-dollar partnership, whether this was the ethical foundation upon which trust was supposed to be built, and whether any board member in that room truly believed that a man who could conceal an affair of this magnitude could be trusted with fiduciary responsibility at the highest level. No one answered. The billion-dollar deal that would have secured Arclight's future dissolved in that moment without a single signature being placed on paper. Stock alerts began pinging on executives' phones as rumors leaked almost instantly to financial media. The value of Arclight Dynamics began dipping before the meeting had even officially adjourned. Daniel attempted to speak, but his words felt hollow against the undeniable evidence projected behind him. This was not a misunderstanding about quarterly projections or a disagreement about valuation metrics. This was betrayal woven directly into the foundation of a partnership built on trust. And what makes this moment even more devastating is that just 24 hours earlier, Daniel had believed he was untouchable. He believed he could manage both worlds, the public empire he was building and the private risk he was taking. He believed secrecy was protection. He believed that personal indulgence would never intersect with professional consequence. If you have ever watched someone climb toward success and wondered how quickly it can unravel, then you already sense that this story is not merely about an affair. It is about ego, ambition, secrecy, and the catastrophic cost of believing you are above consequence. As we go deeper into how this scandal began and why it exploded when it did, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because stories like this expose the thin line between power and collapse, and you will want to follow every layer of what unfolds next. To understand how a single night wiped out a company's future overnight, we must step back long before the boardroom screen flickered to life. We must return to the beginning, to when Arclight Dynamics was nothing more than a bold idea sketched on a whiteboard in a cramped Brooklyn office. Daniel Whitmore was not always the polished executive standing beneath Manhattan skylines. He was once a restless operations analyst who believed that logistics inefficiencies were costing global retailers billions. He saw opportunity where others saw complexity. He worked relentlessly, mortgaged his apartment, convinced 2 college friends to join him, and spent years grinding through rejection after rejection until venture capitalists finally began to listen. His rise attracted admiration, loyalty, and eventually power. With power came proximity to larger players, including TitanSphere Holdings. Richard Voss initially respected Daniel's drive. Their early meetings were professional, strategic, and mutually beneficial. TitanSphere saw Arclight as an agile innovator that could modernize its global supply chain. Arclight saw TitanSphere as the gateway to international dominance. The partnership discussions lasted nearly 11 months, growing in scale and complexity until the final acquisition agreement was drafted. It was during one of those negotiation dinners that Daniel first met Elena Voss in a setting that was not purely corporate. She was intelligent, composed, and carried a quiet dissatisfaction beneath her polished exterior. Their first extended conversation lasted only 15 minutes, but it lingered far longer in Daniel's mind. What began as casual messages about event planning gradually evolved into personal conversations about ambition, loneliness, and the isolation that often accompanies powerful marriages. Daniel convinced himself that emotional connection was harmless, that private meetings were manageable, that he could separate desire from duty. But secrets are rarely as contained as we imagine them to be. Someone knew. Someone watched. Someone waited. And on the morning of February 18, 2025, that someone decided it was time for the world to know. By the time the boardroom meeting ended abruptly and TitanSphere executives exited without shaking hands, Arclight Dynamics had already begun hemorrhaging trust. Employees downstairs sensed something was wrong when media crews began gathering unexpectedly outside the building. Within hours, financial blogs were speculating about ethical misconduct. Investors demanded emergency calls. Board members scheduled a crisis session without Daniel present. What Daniel did not yet realize was that the exposure of the affair was only the first layer of a deeper strategy unfolding behind the scenes. Because when scandals surface at the exact moment contracts are about to be signed, it is rarely coincidence. And the question that remains hanging over Manhattan like the winter fog that morning is this. Was this merely a reckless affair exposed at the worst possible time, or was it a calculated detonation designed to destroy Arclight from within? By 11:32 a.m. that same morning, the 62nd floor of Glass Tower 1 no longer felt like the headquarters of a rising industry leader. It felt like the aftermath of a silent explosion whose shockwave had not yet fully registered in the minds of those standing in its debris. Executives who had arrived earlier with rehearsed smiles and confident forecasts were now gathered in small, tense clusters along the glass corridors, their voices lowered to tense whispers as legal advisors moved briskly between offices carrying folders that suddenly seemed heavier than paper should allow. The stock ticker displayed in the reception area, once a source of quiet pride for employees who passed it every day, now showed a downward trend that continued to dip with each minute that passed, reflecting not only investor anxiety but the market's ruthless instinct to punish instability without waiting for clarification. Daniel Whitmore retreated to his private office overlooking Bryant Park, closing the door behind him with a measured calm that disguised the internal collapse he was struggling to contain. The skyline that had once symbolized conquest now felt like a silent jury watching his fall. He replayed the boardroom moment in his mind with painful clarity. The flicker of the screen, the unmistakable subject line of the email, the way Richard Voss had stood up without raising his voice, and the suffocating stillness that followed. What disturbed Daniel most was not only the exposure of the affair, but the precision of its timing. The leak had not occurred weeks earlier when rumors could have been dismissed or quietly managed. It had detonated at the exact second the final acquisition draft was about to be signed. That level of orchestration suggested intention, and intention implied planning. Across town, inside a private office at TitanSphere Holdings, Richard Voss sat alone, staring at the Manhattan skyline from a vantage point that had once symbolized unshakable dominance. He was not merely a betrayed husband, he was a chairman whose authority had been publicly challenged. To Richard, the affair represented more than personal humiliation. It was a breach of professional respect, an insult delivered in the very arena where reputations are forged and destroyed. His marriage to Elena had long been strained by the pressures of global leadership and public scrutiny, yet the revelation of her involvement with Daniel carried a different weight because it intersected directly with a multi-billion-dollar strategic decision. In Richard's mind, the betrayal was not romantic recklessness alone. It was a threat to TitanSphere's governance standards, and no chairman could afford to appear compromised. Back at Arclight Dynamics, the emergency board session convened without Daniel present, an exclusion that spoke volumes before a single vote had been cast. Several board members argued that the company's valuation was tied closely to Daniel's public persona as an ethical, visionary founder, and that his personal scandal now posed a measurable risk to shareholder confidence. Others insisted that separating private misconduct from corporate performance was possible, but their voices lacked conviction in the face of rapidly spreading media speculation. News outlets had already begun framing the story as a case study in executive arrogance, blending corporate governance concerns with the sensationalism of forbidden relationships. The headline that trended across financial platforms by early afternoon read, "Affair allegations derail $2.3 billion acquisition." The market did not wait for confirmation. It reacted. Elena Voss, meanwhile, found herself confined within a different kind of pressure chamber. Her phone vibrated continuously with messages from journalists, acquaintances, and board associates who had either seen the leak or heard whispers of it. She had known that secrecy carried risk, but she had underestimated how completely exposure would strip away nuance. What had begun months earlier as conversations about loneliness during negotiation dinners had evolved into private meetings, then emotional dependency, and finally a reckless crossing of boundaries that neither she nor Daniel had fully contemplated. In quiet moments, she questioned whether her dissatisfaction within her marriage justified the destruction now unfolding across two corporations. Yet justification felt irrelevant. The consequences had already begun. By late afternoon, Arclight's investors demanded a public statement. Daniel drafted and deleted multiple versions, aware that every word would be dissected by analysts searching for either denial or admission. He understood that crisis communication requires precision, but precision felt impossible while uncertainty clouded every dimension of the situation. Was this purely a moral failure exposed by coincidence, or had someone deliberately engineered the leak to sabotage the acquisition? The security image from the hotel implied access to private surveillance systems. The email thread suggested unauthorized intrusion into personal accounts. Each detail pointed toward a source who possessed both technical capability and strategic motive. As the sun began to set behind the Manhattan skyline, casting long shadows across the glass surfaces of both companies' headquarters, a secondary development emerged that deepened the crisis. A technology journalist published a speculative analysis suggesting that Arclight's rapid growth had threatened established players in the logistics sector, and that the failed acquisition could open space for competitors to reclaim market share. The article did not accuse anyone directly, yet it introduced the possibility that the scandal's exposure might serve interests beyond personal revenge. Within hours, financial forums were flooded with theories ranging from corporate espionage to calculated retaliation by internal rivals. Inside Arclight's open-plan workspace, employees gathered near their desks pretending to focus on tasks while discreetly scrolling through headlines on their phones. Many had joined the company because they believed in Daniel's vision of modernizing supply chains with ethical transparency and technological precision. The revelation of his affair felt like a betrayal not only of Richard Voss, but of the culture Daniel had publicly championed. Trust, once fractured, does not simply require explanation. It demands restoration, and restoration is costly. If you are following this story and sensing that what appears to be a personal scandal may conceal a deeper strategy, you are not alone. Situations like this remind us that power attracts both loyalty and resentment, and that success often creates enemies long before one realizes they exist. If this unfolding narrative is gripping you, consider subscribing and engaging in the comments with your perspective, because the complexity of this downfall lies not only in the affair itself but in the forces that may have weaponized it. As evening settled over the city, Daniel received a message from an anonymous sender containing a single line, "You should have known better." Attached was a screenshot indicating that the email leak had been routed through a masked server located overseas. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had invested time and resources to ensure maximum impact. Daniel's initial assumption that exposure was accidental began to crumble. The possibility that he had been maneuvered into a trap forced him to reconsider every interaction of the past year, every negotiation dinner, every conversation with TitanSphere executives who might have perceived Arclight's growth as a threat rather than an opportunity. Richard Voss convened his own advisory circle that night, not to reconsider the acquisition but to assess reputational containment. He instructed his communications team to frame the termination as a governance decision rooted in ethical standards rather than personal grievance. Publicly, TitanSphere would appear principled and decisive. Privately, however, Richard could not ignore the humiliation of discovering his wife's betrayal in front of a boardroom audience. His calm demeanor during the confrontation had masked an emotional undercurrent that now surfaced in solitude. Anger, disappointment, and wounded pride intertwined with strategic calculation, making his next moves difficult to predict. The most alarming development for Arclight came just before midnight when two major investors signaled their intention to withdraw pending clarity on leadership stability. The company's projected runway, once comfortably positioned for expansion, suddenly narrowed to a precarious margin. Daniel realized that beyond the scandal, a structural threat was emerging. Without TitanSphere's capital infusion and with investor confidence deteriorating, Arclight could face insolvency within months. And yet, beneath the personal regret and corporate chaos, one question persisted like an echo in an empty hall. Who orchestrated the exposure, and why was it timed with such surgical precision? Because if the affair alone had been the story, it might have remained a tragic footnote in executive history. But the orchestration suggested something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more dangerous. As midnight approached and Manhattan's lights shimmered against the dark river, Daniel stood alone in his office, contemplating not only his moral failure but the possibility that he had underestimated the landscape of power in which he operated. The affair had ignited the fire, but the accelerant may have been placed long before he ever stepped into that hotel suite. By the following morning, February 19, 2025, the narrative surrounding Arclight Dynamics had shifted from scandal to survival, and the company that had once symbolized innovation and aggressive expansion now found itself fighting for credibility in an environment that punishes vulnerability without hesitation. Financial analysts dissected the failed acquisition across major networks, corporate governance experts debated ethical boundaries in leadership, and social media amplified speculation faster than legal teams could draft formal statements. What had begun as an exposed affair had evolved into a full-scale crisis of confidence, and for a company operating on growth projections and investor trust, confidence was oxygen. Daniel Whitmore arrived at headquarters earlier than usual, long before most employees had swiped their access cards at the lobby gates. The building felt unfamiliar in the quiet dawn hours, stripped of the energy that once fueled its ambition. He walked through the open workspace observing empty desks, paused screens, and whiteboards filled with strategic roadmaps that now seemed almost naive in their optimism. He had built Arclight on the premise that operational transparency and data-driven decision-making could disrupt an outdated logistics industry, yet he had failed to apply that same discipline to his personal boundaries. The contradiction weighed heavily on him because he understood something fundamental. Markets can forgive miscalculation, but they rarely forgive hypocrisy. Meanwhile, the internal investigation initiated by Arclight's board uncovered troubling details that suggested the leak's origin might not have been external sabotage alone. A senior IT analyst discovered that the Boardroom presentation system had been accessed remotely using administrative credentials belonging to someone within Arclight's executive tier. The timing of the system override coincided precisely with the moment Daniel stood to deliver his closing remarks. That precision required more than random hacking. It required proximity, access, and a deep understanding of the acquisition schedule. As the board digested this information, a chilling possibility surfaced. Someone inside Arclight may have deliberately exposed the affair to derail the deal. The motivations behind such a move were complex. The TitanSphere acquisition, while financially transformative, would have diluted the influence of certain early stakeholders who feared losing strategic control once the conglomerate assumed majority ownership. Among those stakeholders was Marcus Hale, Arclight's chief financial officer and one of its earliest investors. Marcus had publicly supported the acquisition, yet privately he had expressed concerns about becoming a subsidiary under TitanSphere's governance structure. He had built his career on financial autonomy and aggressive scaling strategies, and the idea of answering to TitanSphere's compliance committees had not aligned with his temperament. Though there was no direct evidence linking Marcus to the leak, the convergence of access, timing, and motive placed him under quiet scrutiny. Elena Voss, isolated within the penthouse apartment she once shared with Richard, confronted her own reckoning. The media had not only reported the affair but framed her as a catalyst in corporate destruction, reducing a complex emotional misjudgment to a sensational headline. She had believed that her connection with Daniel existed in a private emotional compartment separate from boardroom negotiations, yet she now understood that in environments where billions of dollars are at stake, nothing remains compartmentalized for long. Richard had not spoken to her beyond brief, measured exchanges regarding legal counsel, and the distance between them felt both physical and permanent. The affair, which once felt like an escape from loneliness, had instead amplified it beyond anything she anticipated. As Arclight's board deliberated Daniel's future, the pressure intensified from external investors demanding leadership restructuring. Several venture partners suggested that the company could regain stability if Daniel voluntarily stepped aside, framing his departure as a strategic reset rather than an admission of guilt. Daniel wrestled with the suggestion because stepping down would mean surrendering the company he had built from nothing, yet remaining in power risked further erosion of trust. He understood that leadership sometimes requires sacrifice, but he questioned whether sacrificing himself would truly protect Arclight or simply accelerate its fragmentation. In the midst of this uncertainty, an encrypted message reached Daniel from a journalist known for exposing corporate misconduct. The message contained a simple question: "Are you aware that the leak originated from inside your boardroom?" Attached was a fragment of server metadata confirming internal routing pathways. Daniel felt a surge of realization that reframed the scandal from personal collapse to strategic ambush. If someone within Arclight orchestrated the exposure, then the affair had been weaponized not solely to punish betrayal but to manipulate corporate destiny. That realization did not absolve him of responsibility, but it introduced a second narrative layer that demanded attention. If you are following this story closely, consider how often public scandals conceal deeper power struggles beneath the surface. Corporate history is filled with examples where personal missteps become tools for strategic advantage, and the intersection of emotion and ambition creates outcomes far more complex than headlines suggest. If this unfolding tension is resonating with you, take a moment to engage with the story and share your thoughts, because understanding the human dimension behind corporate collapse often reveals lessons that extend far beyond the boardroom. Later that afternoon, Arclight's emergency board session reached a pivotal moment when the internal IT report was presented in full. The evidence did not conclusively identify the perpetrator, but it narrowed the field to 3 executives with system privileges, including Marcus Hale. When confronted indirectly during discussion, Marcus maintained composure, expressing outrage that internal security protocols had been breached at all. His calm defense appeared convincing to some board members, yet subtle inconsistencies in his timeline raised quiet suspicion among others. The tension within the boardroom mirrored the tension that had erupted just 24 hours earlier, but this time the conflict was internal, hidden behind polite dialogue and strategic phrasing. Outside the corporate sphere, TitanSphere Holdings publicly announced that it would pursue alternative partnerships, emphasizing its commitment to ethical leadership standards. The statement was carefully crafted to preserve brand integrity while distancing the conglomerate from Arclight's turmoil. Privately, however, Richard Voss authorized his own investigation into the source of the leak, recognizing that if an internal rival at Arclight had engineered the scandal, TitanSphere might have been an unwitting participant in a larger corporate chess match. Richard's pride had been wounded, but his strategic instincts remained sharp, and he was unwilling to accept coincidence without verification. As evening approached, Daniel made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than resign immediately, he requested a temporary leave of absence while the internal investigation proceeded, acknowledging publicly that his personal conduct had compromised the company's stability but insisting that transparency required uncovering the full truth. His statement was measured, neither defensive nor melodramatic, yet the market reaction remained skeptical. Shares dipped further, reflecting investor impatience with ambiguity. In the quiet of his apartment that night, Daniel replayed the events leading up to the affair's exposure, searching for overlooked signals. He recalled a brief conversation months earlier when Marcus had warned him that TitanSphere's acquisition terms would erode Arclight's independence. He remembered noticing Marcus lingering near the boardroom tech console before the final meeting, though at the time it had seemed inconsequential. Now, those details felt charged with potential meaning. The affair had been reckless, but perhaps it had also been anticipated by someone who understood its power as leverage. The question that lingered was no longer limited to whether Daniel's actions destroyed Arclight's future, but whether someone else had been waiting for precisely such a vulnerability to exploit. If ambition had driven Daniel into secrecy, ambition might also have driven another executive into sabotage. And when ambition collides with opportunity, the results can reshape entire industries. As Manhattan's skyline dimmed into night once again, 2 parallel investigations unfolded, one into personal betrayal and another into corporate manipulation. The truth, buried beneath layers of ego and strategy, threatened to redefine not only Arclight's trajectory but the reputations of everyone involved. The morning of February 20th, 2025, arrived with an almost surreal quiet over Manhattan, as though the city itself had sensed the collapse of what had seemed unshakable just days before. Glass Tower 1, normally alive with the hum of ambition and the chatter of executives rushing to boardrooms, now felt cold, distant, and strangely empty. The lobby, usually a place of energetic greetings and confident strides, was subdued. Security personnel whispered among themselves as Daniel Whitmore, escorted by his personal assistant, ascended to the 62nd floor, though his footsteps were heavy with the weight of both personal regret and professional uncertainty. In the previous 48 hours, Arclight Dynamics had gone from a company on the cusp of global transformation to an organization teetering on the brink of financial and reputational collapse. Daniel's office had been stripped of its usual warmth. Personal mementos were packed into boxes, the sunlight filtered through dusted blinds, and the hum of the city felt muted. He knew that he could no longer rely on charisma or ambition alone. The collapse had exposed vulnerabilities far deeper than he had anticipated. The TitanSphere acquisition had been the lifeline for Arclight's expansion strategy, but with it gone, and investor confidence eroded by the scandal, the company's runway had narrowed to what felt like the precipice of insolvency. Daniel had always believed in control, in managing perception, in staying 10 steps ahead, but the affair, and its calculated exposure, had stripped him of the illusion of invincibility. Meanwhile, the the internal investigation into the leak that had publicly exposed his private life began to take form. IT auditors meticulously traced server access logs, network packets, and login histories, searching for anomalies that could pinpoint the culprit. What they discovered was alarming. Administrative access had been utilized not by a hacker from outside the company but from within Arclight itself, timed to coincide with the final boardroom meeting. The precision of the leak left no doubt that this had been orchestrated deliberately, not accidentally. As names began to surface, Daniel realized that the betrayal within his own ranks was as dangerous as the one exposed to the public. Marcus Hale, CFO, a man he had trusted implicitly, emerged as a primary suspect. Marcus had both the motive and the means, and in corporate power struggles, ambition can often become lethal when cloaked behind civility. Elena Voss, at TitanSphere Holdings, moved through a parallel but equally calculated set of motions. Publicly, she appeared composed, attending meetings, hosting charity events, and maintaining appearances as the wife of a billionaire chairman. Privately, however, she was consumed with guilt, isolation, and fear. The leak of her private life had not only destroyed Daniel's acquisition but also fractured her marriage irrevocably. Her choices, though personal, had created a chain reaction with consequences far beyond the scope of her imagination. She understood now that in the world of high-stakes business, personal indiscretions could become powerful instruments of destruction, capable of reshaping empires overnight. By late morning, Daniel convened an emergency executive session with the remaining board members. The tension in the room was palpable. Eyes darted nervously between faces, the silence punctuated only by the low hum of air conditioning and the occasional click of a laptop. Daniel laid out the facts as he knew them: the exposure of his affair, the abrupt termination of the TitanSphere deal, and the internal IT evidence suggesting a deliberate leak. He emphasized that, despite the scandal, Arclight still had the talent, vision, and operational capacity to recover, but only if decisive action was taken immediately. Several board members nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical, their expressions betraying fear and uncertainty. After all, leadership credibility had been irrevocably shaken. Outside the walls of Arclight, the market's response continued to deepen the crisis. Stock valuations, though privately held, were already being discussed by financial analysts as at risk of implosion. Articles circulated on LinkedIn and corporate blogs questioning not just Daniel's ethical judgment but also the structural resilience of the company. Potential partners who had been considering joint ventures paused their communications. Clients placed cautious inquiries, and employees began to whisper about possible layoffs or restructuring. The ripple effect of a single personal scandal was far larger than Daniel, or anyone else, had anticipated. Adding to the strain was the realization that Daniel was not simply recovering from a moral lapse but navigating an intricate web of corporate politics, both internal and external. If Marcus had orchestrated the leak, he would have been counting on Daniel's reaction, on the market's reaction, and on TitanSphere's immediate disengagement. It was an attack calibrated to maximize damage at precisely the wrong moment for Daniel. Simultaneously, Daniel's own personal failings made him vulnerable, providing justification in the eyes of some that the company's leadership was compromised. The intersection of personal error and strategic betrayal was complete. A perfect storm in the corporate world. In the late afternoon, Daniel met briefly with Marcus under the supervision of the board's legal team. Marcus maintained a calm demeanor, articulating concern over the company's direction while carefully avoiding admission. His controlled posture contrasted with Daniel's visible fatigue, tension, and lingering guilt. Yet beneath Marcus' calm lay an unmistakable undercurrent of calculated intent, the subtle signals of someone who understood the potential of exploiting the perfect alignment of personal weakness and corporate opportunity. As the city lights flickered on across the skyline and the Hudson River reflected the last traces of sunlight, Daniel walked to the edge of his office window, looking down at the streets far below. Manhattan was indifferent to human failure, indifferent to betrayal, indifferent to ambition crushed in an instant. He reflected on how fragile success can be when it relies on both perception and trust, and how easily both can be shattered by a single act of indiscretion. The affair, once private and seemingly manageable, had now cascaded into financial jeopardy, internal suspicion, and the destruction of relationships that had taken years to build. In these final hours of Part 4, the lesson was brutally clear. In the high-stakes world of business, personal choices are inseparable from professional consequence. One misjudgment, one hidden desire, one secret affair, and an entire company's future can vanish overnight. Daniel had learned, at the steepest cost, that ambition without ethical discipline is fragile, that trust once broken is nearly impossible to fully restore, and that human vulnerability can be weaponized in ways no financial projection could ever anticipate. The boardroom battle was over, the acquisition lost, and Arclight Dynamics' future hung in a precarious balance, teetering between recovery and collapse. Yet even as the immediate crisis stabilized into cautious assessment, the aftermath of betrayal, both personal and corporate, would continue to reverberate, leaving questions that would haunt every decision moving forward. And so, the story of the affair that wiped out a company's future overnight concludes with a warning and a reflection. In the intertwined world of ambition, desire, and power, nothing remains private for long, and no empire is truly safe from the consequences of personal failure.